A storm churned over the Sierra Blanca peaks, turning the late summer sky the color of gunmetal. Lightning split the horizon just as a lone adobe cabin came into view, perched on a rocky ledge like it had clawed itself out of the mountain. Inside, Caleb Finch felt the air thin the way it always did before trouble found him. 12 years alone did not dull that sense, it sharpened it like whetstone on steel. A new bolt cracked so close that the cabin's windowpanes rattled. Caleb crossed the plank floor, Henry rifle in hand, but before he reached the door a low drumbeat rose from the canyon below, 15 silhouettes on horseback, long hair whipping in the wind, eyes catching what little light leaked through the clouds. Apaches. Tall against the storm. No war paint, no raised weapons, only unreadable faces under dripping hat brims and braided headbands. Caleb's first thought was of the Springfield he kept buried beneath the porch, his second was of the bronze medallion tucked in a tobacco tin, U.S. Cavalry, 6th Regiment, reminding him why he had fled these hills a dozen years ago. The strangers halted 5 paces from the porch. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with an owl feather at his temple, spoke in measured English, "The white coats ride behind us. We need shelter." He was asking, not begging. Caleb noticed the youngest of them clutching her side, dark blood soaking a deerskin shirt. A memory surged, mesquite smoke, a burning homestead, screams that never quieted. He had promised himself no more sides, no more guns, yet here stood 15 reasons the past had ridden to find him. He pushed open the door wide enough for rain to streak the threshold. "You men leave your rifles on the rail. Women and wounded first." The leader nodded once. One by one they dismounted, leaning their Winchesters against the corral. Caleb ushered them into the single-room cabin, the storm following as a moan through the rafters. He convinced himself this was temporary, a night's mercy owed to no one, but when the last rider stepped inside, the girl with the bleeding flank fainted against his chest. A clap of thunder sealed the moment like a judge's gavel. They laid her on Caleb's cot. He heated water, shredded an old shirt for bandages, ground willow bark for pain. While he worked, the leader watched, arms folded, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Name's Eli Dakia," he said. "Chiricahua." Caleb muttered his own name but offered nothing more. Eli finally spoke what Caleb feared. "The whitecoats, you call them Pinkertons, chase us. By dawn they'll be here." Caleb's gut tightened. Pinkertons did not take prisoners, they collected bounties. The Apaches had likely defended grazing land men in suits intended to sign away. Caleb stared at the Henry leaning by the door and realized the ridge he'd chosen for solitude was now a battleground he couldn't step around. The storm eased near midnight. Moonlight slid through broken clouds, silvering the cabin's rough-hewn walls. Most of the riders slept upright, hands near knives. Only Eli remained awake, studying Caleb as if reading a ledger. "You fought at Sand Creek?" Eli asked quietly. Caleb's breath hitched. He'd buried that massacre beneath whiskey and miles of desert, yet somehow Eli knew. "I was there," Caleb admitted, voice raw. "Not by choice." Eli nodded, as though confirming a ledger entry, then gestured toward the girl, his sister. She was not by choice, either. A coyote yipped on the far ridge. Caleb realized he hadn't heard that sound since before sunset, the hills had gone too quiet. He stepped onto the porch and saw campfires sparking in the darkness 2 miles downslope, circles of orange blooming like malignant flowers. The Pinkertons had made their own weather and were closing fast. Caleb returned inside, heart pounding with a rhythm he hadn't felt since cavalry charges. He cleared the table, unrolled maps he'd kept for hunting trails, and spoke a word he hadn't used in years, plan. Eli's expression didn't change, but something in his shoulders eased, like a gate unlatched. Before dawn's pale hint touched the peaks, Caleb and Eli moved silently through pinyon shadows, setting snares not for animals but for men, tripwire rigged to rockfalls, dead branches prepared to stampede the Pinkertons' horses. Higher on the ridge, Caleb unearthed the Springfield and a bundle of cartridges. He had run from ghosts for 12 years, now he loaded them, one metallic click after another. Back at the cabin, the girl, Naila, woke, pain-glazed but breathing. She gripped Caleb's sleeve. "Home," she whispered, in accented English. "We only wanted to keep our home." Her fingers trembled like bird wings before releasing. Caleb realized the cabin he'd treated as a tomb might become something else if these people survived the sunrise. Pink light edged the horizon when the first rifle shot cracked. Dust puffed near the corral post, wood splintering. Caleb took position behind a rock outcrop. Eli's men melted into scrub like phantoms. The Pinkertons advanced in tight formation, navy dusters flapping, repeating rifles leveled. Caleb sighted down the Springfield, exhaled, and fired. The lead rider toppled, horse screaming. Chaos erupted, shouts, returning fire, horses rearing as snares snapped rocks loose. For 2 hours the hills roared. Caleb's shoulder numbed from recoil, spent shells smoked at his feet. When the final echo faded, 6 Pinkertons lay still, the rest retreating in panic, leaving dust spirals that quickly erased them. Silence fell heavier than any gunfire. Caleb staggered back toward the cabin, boots slipping on blood-slick shale. Eli met him halfway. They didn't speak, both knew the cost wasn't paid in full, but in Eli's eyes Caleb saw something unfamiliar, invitation rather than judgment. Inside, Naila managed a thin smile. Caleb eased onto a stool, exhaustion crashing over him like the storm hours earlier. He glanced at the medallion Eli had set on the table, a quiet reminder of what Caleb had been. Without a word, Eli slid it across the rough wood toward him. Caleb closed his hand around the tarnished bronze, feeling its weight change. Not a shackle now, but a marker of what he might yet become. Outside, clouds broke entirely, revealing a sky scrubbed clean. Smoke from extinguished campfires drifted upward, weaving with morning light. Caleb inhaled the scent of wet earth and gunpowder, knowing the hills would never again be silent, and, for the first time in 12 years, not wanting them to be. Dawn stretched into a copper noon as the fallen Pinkertons were hauled to a ravine and covered with stones. Eli and Caleb worked side by side, shovels biting the dry earth, saying little. Death had its own silence, and both men had long ago learned to respect it. When the graves were marked with a single cairn, Eli took a slender cedar branch, cut a notch into it with his knife, and planted it in the heap. Caleb recognized the gesture, an Apache sign that a spirit's journey had begun and would not be followed. By late afternoon Naila could stand, though her wound seeped whenever she moved. Caleb mixed more willow bark in boiling water, added a pinch of sage, and handed her the bitter cup. She swallowed without flinching. Behind her, the other riders mended tack and rebraided horsehair reins. Everything about them spoke of transience, yet they moved as though the cabin were already theirs to protect. Caleb sharpened his bowie at the porch rail, watching dust devils twist across the valley. They would not have much respite. Pinkertons traveled with telegraph codes in their saddlebags. By now someone in Tucson or Fort Huachuca knew 15 Apaches and a rogue frontiersman had killed 6 hired guns. A posse would be commissioned, bigger and less forgiving. Caleb felt the desert heat press on his scarred shoulder like a warning hand. Toward evening Eli approached, carrying a weather-worn map folded into fourths. He laid it on the porch between them, smoothing the creases. Black ink trails snaked through mountain passes, converging on a red X south of the Gila River. It marked an abandoned copper mine whose tunnels, Eli said, connected to caverns older than any tribal story. If the posse came, the hills would become a noose, the caverns offered a chance to vanish. Caleb studied the route. The mine sat in territory claimed by the Santa Clara Company, men as ruthless as the Pinkertons they hired. He traced a finger along arroyos he once scouted for cavalry patrols and saw the flaw. "Water," he murmured. 2 days' ride through dry wash. "Your horses won't stomach it." Eli answered by tapping a faded blue scribble, an artesian spring hidden in a box canyon, known only to Chiricahua scouts and, apparently, to him. Caleb nodded, conceding the point. They agreed to leave at moonrise. The riders packed light, jerked venison, bullets wrapped in oiled cloth, a coil of hemp rope. Naila insisted on riding despite her bandage. She would not burden anyone, she said, least of all the stranger who had stitched her wound. Caleb didn't argue. Pride was another medicine. The night climbed purple over the peaks. Caleb saddled his dun mare, Ella, feeling the old rhythm return, the subtle lean of hips, the cinched tug, the soft click of stirrup leathers. 12 years of quiet had not erased the muscle memory. As they filed into the canyon, he glanced back at the cabin. Lamplight glowed through the single dusty pane. For a fleeting breath he wondered if he'd ever see that warm square again. The first league passed under owl cries and the steady clop of hooves on shale. Eli rode point, Caleb rear guard. Somewhere in the middle, Naila hummed a tune that rose and fell like wind over broken bottles. Caleb recognized no words, yet the melody coiled around his thoughts. He kept scanning the ridgelines, hunting for any glint of steel or moonlight on a rifle barrel. Near midnight they descended into a wash where cottonwoods grew thick despite the season's drought. The spring awaited at its head wall, a silver pool beneath overhanging limestone. While horses drank, the riders crouched in a semicircle, chewing jerky, letting silence do their talking. Caleb knelt beside Naila, checked the cloth beneath her doeskin vest. The bleeding had slowed, but her fever was rising. He muttered about the need for cool water and stepped into the pool's shallows, filling his hat. When he returned, Eli had produced a carved wooden flute. He raised it to his lips, breathing out a low, mournful line that slipped through cottonwood leaves like smoke. Naila's eyes closed, her shoulders eased. Caleb felt something loosen in his own chest, a knot he'd blamed on war but now recognized as loneliness. The respite ended when thunder rumbled, no storm, but detonations rolling across the night. Far behind them, above the wash, a bloom of orange lifted into the sky. Caleb's cabin, its lamp still burning, was now a torch against the darkness. The posse had arrived early and delivered their answer. Flames reflected in Eli's calm eyes. No one spoke. They mounted and rode harder. Just before dawn the land opened into badlands striped red and ochre. Hoodoo spires rose like petrified spirits pointing accusation at the heavens. The mine shaft crouched halfway up a ridge, its timbers charred and sagging. They dismounted, leading horses inside the yawning entrance. Torchlight revealed shafts branching in every direction, walls glittering with abandoned ore. The air smelled of ancient dust and something older, perhaps the weight of untold stories. Caleb and Eli chose a tunnel that sloped downward toward the rumored caverns. They left 2 riders to conceal hoofprints at the entrance. In the dim torch glow, Naila's face gleamed with sweat. Caleb feared infection. Deep underground they found a cathedral-sized chamber, stalactites dripping like stone daggers. A subterranean river whispered through a crack, and cool mist eased the desert heat baked into their clothes. Eli declared they would rest until nightfall, then scout further passage west. Caleb unpacked what little medical supplies remained. He crushed dried yarrow to sprinkle on Naila's wound and bound it tighter. She clutched his wrist, murmur slipping between English and Chiricahua. He caught fragments, guardian, spirits, broken horse. None made sense but all felt important. While the riders slept, Caleb walked the cavern's circumference. Strange glyphs etched into the limestone drew his lamp. Stylized deer leaped beside spiral suns, a single human figure pointed east with an elongated arm. It was older than the mine, perhaps older than any tribe now roaming the southwest. Caleb felt gooseflesh prickle. The arm pointed toward a narrow fissure choked by rubble. Instinct whispered. He fetched Eli. Together they pried rocks free until a draft of night air fluttered the torch. Beyond the fissure lay a squeezed tunnel that, if passable, could lead past the ridge into Mexican territory, salvation from U.S. warrants. Eli's eyes shone with wary hope, yet something in the glyphs unsettled him. He traced the arm, lips moving in a prayer Caleb did not understand. Their debate was cut short by an echoing shout from the mine entrance. The posse had found the shaft. Bootsteps clanged on iron rails, voices barking orders to spread lanterns. Time collapsed into urgent whispers. Eli ordered the riders toward the fissure. Caleb gathered stray cartridges, heart pounding like war drums he thought he'd buried in Colorado silt. Near the entrance, lantern glow wavered. Shadows loomed, Pinkertons advancing in tight formation, revolvers cocked. Caleb took cover behind a rotting support beam, lifted his Henry, and sighted down the barrel. He breathed once, twice, then held. A single shot rang, but not his. One of Eli's riders, posted above the shaft, detonated a dynamite stick meant for closing the tunnel once their people were clear. The blast collapsed timbers, rock showering sparks. Dust roared down the main shaft, swallowing lanternlight. Screams echoed, then silence so deep Caleb feared the mountain itself had ceased to breathe. Choking dust blurred every outline. Caleb stumbled back toward the fissure, coughing slate. Through the grit he saw Naila, pale but upright, leaning on Eli's arm. He ushered them into the squeeze tunnel. One by one they vanished into shadow. Caleb lingered, listening for any sound of pursuit. Only falling pebbles answered. He crawled after them, rifle slung, the tunnel scraping his shoulders until daylight winked ahead. He emerged onto a ledge overlooking a basin lush with mesquite and the faint glimmer of a river. The riders gathered among boulders, faces drawn but unbroken. Eli stepped forward, clasped Caleb's forearm with the grip of kin, and pointed across the valley. "Freedom," he said, as though the word were a place rather than an idea. Below, a dust plume rose where cavalry might one day ride, but for the moment the basin lay quiet, waiting. Caleb inhaled the scent of blooming creosote carried on dawn wind. He realized mystery still coiled ahead, what lay beyond the basin, what stories the cavern glyphs hinted, whether the posse truly lay entombed, but his heart beat with an unfamiliar cadence, neither flight nor fight. It sounded like belonging. Evening light bled out of the basin until only the river held a ribbon of silver. Caleb, Eli, Naila and the 13 weary riders kept to the mesquite shadows, moving west along the watercourse. They pressed on until starlight glazed their horses' flanks, then stopped beneath a leaning cottonwood where frogs croaked like distant drums. Every mile stolen from the mine felt borrowed, not won. The posse might be dead, but the territory still belonged to men who put warrants on paper and iron on wrists. Caleb crouched by the riverbank, washing dust from a coffee pot. Moonlit water mirrored a face he barely knew, cheeks hollowed by solitude, eyes sharpened by purpose. Behind him Naila eased down beside the roots, breath hitching as she lowered herself. Fever shimmered on her skin. Caleb dipped the pot, letting cold water spill over her bandage. She closed her eyes, murmuring a Chiricahua phrase that sounded like thanks woven into warning. He wished he understood. Hours later campfire embers winked low. Eli approached, carrying a ledger-thin packet wrapped in deerskin. He unfolded it to reveal a single scrap of newsprint smeared with wagon grease. The headline announced Santa Clara Copper to expand holdings south of the Gila, bolstered by Pinkerton security. Beneath, a note in tight penciled script marked the riders hostiles and offered $500 a head. Eli tapped the page and said, "Word travels faster than horses." Caleb stared at the bounty list, his own surname scrawled among Apache names. 12 years of hiding had collapsed into ink. At dawn they rode again, following deer trails that braided through Ocotillo and Prickly Pear. The basin gradually lifted toward rolling grassland, where dust clouds on the northern horizon hinted at pursuit, maybe troopers from Fort Bowie, maybe company men. Caleb counted time by the girl's worsening cough. At midday her lips cracked despite sips of water, and she slumped in the saddle. Eli signaled a halt beneath a lone juniper. Caleb pressed a palm to her brow, burning. Infection had outrun the willow bark. He emptied his saddlebag, laying out his last cartridges beside a sewing kit, a brass compass, and the tarnished cavalry medallion. The compass needle trembled toward south-southwest, where across an invisible line lay Sonora and the chance of amnesty. But south meant another day's hard ride, too far for Naila. Caleb scanned the horizon and saw, 3 ridges east, a neglected adobe mission he had once glimpsed during a cattle drive. Franciscans had abandoned it after raiders burned the bell tower. If its well still held water, its storeroom might still shelter medicines left by pilgrims. He proposed the detour. Eli weighed the risk, then nodded. They reached the mission by late afternoon. Wind moaned through archways blackened by soot, and a condition of stillness clung to the courtyard, as if prayers lingered like dust motes. Inside the sacristy Caleb found shelves collapsed under termite-gnawed hymnals, but behind a stone font lay a trunk crusted with soot. He pried it open to a faint smell of camphor. Glass vials rattled beside packets of quinine and a folded oilcloth labeled Tinctura Iodinii. Salvation in a ruined church. Caleb crushed quinine tablets, mixed them with river water, and coaxed Naila to drink. He flushed her wound with iodine, pulse thrumming in his ears at each gasp she gave. Nightfall draped the nave in shadow, riders bedded down between pews, rifles across their chests. High overhead, bat wings flicked through a hole where the bell had once hung. Near midnight hoofbeats shattered the hush. Caleb and Eli rushed to the archway, a lone scout, breath smoking, reported riders massing a mile north, 30, maybe more, wearing cavalry hats and Pinkerton dusters alike. The posse was reborn, hungrier for reputations than for pay. The mission's stone walls offered refuge but could become a tomb if siege dragged on. Eli turned to Caleb. "You know their ways," he said. Caleb's stomach nodded with truths. Yes, he knew the drill of encirclement, the timing of volleys, the arrogance that made bluecoats push frontal assaults. He walked the courtyard, fingertips brushing bullet-scarred adobe, memory stitching itself to present. At Sand Creek he had watched soldiers slaughter families under a white flag. Afterward he quit the uniform but carried the guilt like a spur buried in flesh. In the mission's dim corridor he found a broken confessional. Kneeling where penitents once whispered, he did not pray, he planned. The courtyard gate, the collapsed bell tower, the dry irrigation trenches, each could bend an attacker's advance. But numbers still favored the posse. When he rose, Naila leaned against the doorway, swaying but standing. Fever dulled her eyes yet left them resolute. In stilted English she said, "River spirits hide beneath earth. Dig shallow, they breathe fire." Caleb puzzled, then followed her gaze to clay jars stacked near the altar, ancient storage vessels streaked black from previous blaze. The missionaries had stored lamp oil there. If trenches filled with oil snaked out from the gate, a single spark could sever an assault. Through the wilderness of night the riders dug with tin cups and blades, carving channels from courtyard to outer wall. They emptied jars, the oil glugging like dark wine. Caleb paced ignition points, placing wads of cloth soaked in spirits. Dawn's gray fingers pried open the horizon as they took positions. Naila lay beneath the choir loft, Henry rifle steadied on a sill despite tremors in her arms. Morning light exposed the posse, cavalry boots, mercenary coats, a Gatling gun trundling behind two mules. At a shouted command they fanned into skirmish line. A bugle blared, an old thread of music Caleb once followed without question. Now it curdled his blood. The first volley cracked, lead pinging off stone. Dust and lime showered the nave. Caleb signaled, two riders at the trench mouth struck flints, sparks blooming into flame. Oil hissed, then roared, a sudden wall of fire curling skyward. Horses reared, bucking troopers into thorn scrub. Gatling crew scrambled as heat licked their powder crates, igniting them in a thunder that rattled saintly statues from niches. Smoke blinded both sides. From loopholes the Apache rifles barked, picking silhouettes against orange glare. Caleb dropped one trooper who staggered too close, then another. Return fire chipped masonry inches from his cheek. Amid the roar, he heard Naila cry out, a bullet creased her forearm. She gritted teeth, chambered another round, and kept firing. Minutes stretched until the Gatling, its crew stunned, fell silent. Flames dwindled to smoldering ditches. When the smoke thinned, surviving Pinkertons broke, dragging wounded, spurring mounts hell-bent north. Two riders tried flanking west but met Eli's knife in the irrigated orchard, silent work, over fast. The mission interior echoed now only with hoarse snorts and the ragged breathing of the living. In the courtyard dust Caleb knelt beside Naila, binding her arm. She met his eyes. No words. None needed. He stood, legs trembling not with fear but release. The posse had shattered, the warrant worth less than paper charred in the ditch. At dusk they buried their own dead, only one rider lost, the youngest, struck during the first volley. They raised stone markers beside the mission wall, Eli carving symbols with his knife, Caleb lighting a stub of candle rescued from the altar. When flame touched wick, its glow colored the medallion hanging at Caleb's neck, a token no longer of shame but of paths crossed and debts paid. That night a storm gathered beyond distant cliffs, lightning veining the clouds but sending only cool wind to the basin. Under its breath the riders prepared to move again, south toward Sonora's border where Mexican rurales cared little for American bounties and where Apache bands found uneasy refuge. Caleb packed sparse belongings, rifle, knife, compass, and one clay shard from the burned oil jar, proof of what fire may birth. Before mounting, he walked to the confessional and wedged the cavalry medallion into a crack above the kneeler. Let it tarnish there, a relic among relics. He would carry forward lighter. They rode out under stars scrubbed bright by the coming rain. Naila slept against her horse's mane, fever had broken, leaving her face calm. Eli rode at Caleb's side. Without turning, he spoke, "You have no more hills to hide in, Finch." Caleb glanced skyward where constellations wheeled over a frontier wider than fear. "No," he said, voice steady as trail granite. "Only roads to ride." Thunder echoed like distant drums, neither warning nor omen but simple declaration of weather upon empty land. The column dipped into a shallow arroyo, lantern light swaying, figures merging with shadow until even hoofbeats dissolved into night. Somewhere ahead lay a river to cross, new country to shape, and stories yet to earn their telling. Behind them, the mission's broken bell tower stood silhouetted against flickering sky, silent witness to a man who had chosen belonging over exile and found, in strangers once called enemies, a path into morning.